Recently, I was talking with a friend of mine over breakfast, and we got to talking about our doctors. And she mentioned that she had been going to the same dentist for 15 years, but she was literally one warm referral away from leaving her dental office. And I thought to myself, wow, I wonder how many other people are feeling that as well. And so I continued to ask and continue to receive the same feedback. And I asked her specifically, I said, well, what's making you want to leave? And she said, well, my dentist retired and sold the practice to someone else. And all the warm, fuzzy feelings I had with the practice and with my former dentist evaporated overnight. And no one's ever taken the initiative or wanted to bring those warm, fuzzy feelings back. And so, if you are experiencing a physician loss in your practice, there are some specific things that you should think about before that transition occurs so that you don't lose patients. In this week's episode, those are exactly the things we're going to dive into, as well as the math behind those physician transitions. If we haven't met yet, I'm Elisa Connor, and I show up here every week to help medical specialty practices and professional service organizations to grow, not by outspending their competitors, but instead by creating patient and customer experiences that your patients and customers can't wait to talk about. This week, we're diving into what happens if you lose a physician in your practice, and specifically what happens not only financially, but to your patients when that physician leaves. What is often overlooked or not given the magnitude of attention that it needs is where patients fit into the overall dynamic of a physician leaving. Oftentimes there can be an upheaval behind the scenes of like, who's going to take over the patients? Who are we going to get to fill the role? And there's a lot of administrative tasks that become priorities. When in actuality, without patients, you won't have any of those administrative tasks to take care of. And I've seen too many times that the patient experience has been left either completely out of the equation or it's just tacked on as an afterthought. And trust me, it feels that way to patients. When a patient is invested in your practice and they've been there for an extended amount of time, it's not necessarily just the competence of their doctor and knowing that they're going to do a good job. It's the overall atmosphere and the relationship that they've built, not only with the doctor, but also with their team and the people that are involved in their regular interactions. For example, if you're going to the dentist, you're not just going to see the dentist. In fact, most often, unless you have some underlying condition that needs to be addressed, like a cavity, a crown, or something like that, you're spending most of your time with the hygienist or with their assistant. And if you have a poor relationship with one of those two, it's definitely going to affect the way that you are interacting with the dentist. And oftentimes when there's a changeover, specifically in dentistry, the physician that is leaving the practice for whatever reason, maybe they're retiring, they're going to a different practice, whatever it might be, their team likely will transition with them either outside of the practice or will not continue to see the patients. So when my dentist retired and left, I knew that it was coming. He was, making it pretty clear that he was ready to be retired and had new people lined up in the practice that had been there for a significant amount of time so that you could get to know them. And so when I spoke to my hygienist, she's like, this is who I recommend, and I think you're really going to like them. And so I switched to that dentist. Now, the transition as far as how it was handled from my dental office was handled very well. They gave plenty of notification to patients. They actually had a farewell party for Dr. Drenko before he left. And the overall feel of the transition was handled fairly well. What was handled less spectacularly was the transition of the team that was supporting the new dentist. Now, because you spend so much time with the behind the scenes team when you go to the dentist, if you just automatically transition those people and the patients have had relationships long term, especially if it's something significant like extensive dental work, they are actually more comfortable with the support team than they are often with the dentist, because the dentist is only there for a few minutes. And then the rest of the appointment is spent with the dental assistant or whoever else is on the team. And so if you're looking at that from the position of transitioning a new dentist into your practice, you also need to consider the team that is supporting that dentist. Are they staying? Are they going? Or is it going to be a combination? Now, in my case, it was a new team. The new team I didn't like at all, actually. And it has put a bad taste in my mouth because I spend so much time with the team and very little time with my dentist. Now, I love my dentist. He's very good at what he does. But the people he's surrounded him with, I cannot say the same about. And so if you were to ask me about my dental experience, I would be one of the people that's in the boat of I'm one warm referral away from leaving my dentist. And I've been with my dentist for over 20 years. So if you are experiencing this in your practice and you are wondering, like, for example, a really great dentist that's going to retire, what kind of action plan or what should we be preparing before they leave? And how is it going to affect our patients? And that's the second part of that question is really the most important part to ask, because without patients, you don't have a business, regardless of who's filling the position of dentist. I'm not saying that the transition shouldn't focus on the other aspects of replacing that position. There are going to be legal aspects, there are going to be financial aspects, operational continuity, and all of the other components that go behind the scenes that most patients aren't aware of. But what most practices don't take into consideration is how it's going to affect the patient, especially if patients have been long-term patients and will continue to be patients because they, have quite a bit of life left in them to go to, say, the dentist. So chances are pretty high if you've gone through one of these transitions, you did have some sort of plan in place. And you likely sent out a one-time announcement, whether it was an email, a letter, both. You may have announced it on social media, whatever it might be, to say, we want to say farewell to Dr. So-and-so, and this is his last day in the practice. And that's great. That is absolutely what you should do, and you should make people aware. But if you've stopped there, then that could be where you're getting yourself into trouble. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that those communications can get missed. They can be accidentally thrown away if they're mailed to them. They could end up in spam or junk if they're emailed, or somebody may just miss the social post because the algorithm wasn't friendly that day. So if you are expecting that your patients automatically are going to know that the physician is leaving and you haven't communicated it in more than one opportunity, chances are pretty high you're going to have some confusion with incoming patients that don't know that the physician is leaving. If you are operating under the assumption that because you have the same front desk and the same billing people and the same sort of front of house people, that the transition is going to go smoothly and that everyone's going to be on board, this is another place where people make a mistake. Because just because those faces are familiar, it doesn't mean that the behind the scenes or that the actual appointment or interaction with the team behind the scenes is going to be the same or even similar. Every physician has their own way of doing things and their own way of operating, and obviously their own team who bring different personalities, different skill sets. And sometimes it's not just the unfamiliarity with the new team, it's the comparison to what they had before to the new team. And sometimes that is unfair, but it is still going to happen. And if you haven't addressed it or you're not listening to your patients when they are bringing challenges to your attention, then you're missing the boat. And we're going to talk about what that means financially in just a few minutes. So if you are not spending part of your decision making around the exiting of a partner or a physician owner in your practice, and you're not deliberately planning some sort of communication strategy and plan around the patient experience, you are not only leaving money on the table, you are likely forcing your patients to go to the competition, because I can guarantee you, especially the private equity organizations that are swooping up so many practices and taking over the medical industry, really have a plan in place. And they probably not only have one version of a plan, they probably have multiple versions of a plan so that they have a backup plan. And they've given a lot of time, thought, and attention to how transitions are going to affect their patients. And patients have now come to expect that that is normal for every practice. So if you're not doing that, you're not creating a communication strategy around how you're going to talk to patients about what's happening in your office and making it a smooth transition for them, then you are going to be losing out to your competitors. And let me preface that by saying, this isn't your fault. This is business management skills that were likely never taught to you because you were busy, I don't know, learning how to be a doctor. So unfortunately, that is one of the advantages of a private equity organization, is that they have business managers on their team that are regularly immersed in the trenches with physicians. And if you don't have that skill set and you don't have the people on your team who have that mindset, that business mindset, that will also affect the long-term growth and stability and success of your practice. So I've alluded to a couple of times in this episode already what this means financially. And I broke this down by 4 different practices because I talk a lot about orthopedics. Those are easy statistics, but I went the extra mile and I did some research for 3 different practices. And I always encourage you, if you have a different specialty than some of those that I mentioned in the episode, that you do your own math and figure out exactly what it means to your office if you're losing a physician, or the potential that if you did lose a physician, so that you can plan ahead. And sometimes these transitions happen quickly. Sometimes they're expected, like with my dentist, we knew he was going to retire. He'd been there for, 20, 25 years, maybe in 30 years, and his kids were grown and he wanted to go travel and frankly focus on being a grandfather. So whether they're expected or unexpected, it's always a good idea to have a backup plan in place. And so let's dive into what the practice math looks like for these different practice specialty types. Of course, first up is orthopedics. Typically, if a orthopedic surgeon leaves a practice, there is an average of 15 to 25% turnover. And so when I did the math for these numbers, I tried to find the percentage right in the middle, just so you know, going forward with the math equations. So if the average annual value for a patient is between $2,500 and $4,500, of course, this is highly weighted dependent on surgical cases, because in orthopedics, surgical cases always are more financially viable. If the average number of patients annually that a physician sees is around 900 in orthopedics, and we're going to take the middle of the turnover percentage at 20%, you're looking at 180 patients that are susceptible to leaving the practice. And if we're looking at the average patient value between 25 and 4,500, we're going to split the difference and call it 3,500. That's $630,000 at stake per physician. If we're looking at the lifetime value for those same patients, the numbers are significantly different. In orthopedics specifically, the lifetime value for a patient is somewhere between $10,000 and $25,000. So of course, we're going to split the difference again and multiply that once again by 90. And the split difference is 15,000. That is $2.7 million per physician. So if you have a physician leaving and just 20% of the patients leave with them, you're looking at $2.7 million in lifetime value. And these numbers are very conservative. I always calculate on the conservative end of things because I think it's important for you to know that this is normally the starting point. Like most often, it's higher than this. So when you're calculating your numbers and you're looking at your percentages and they're higher and your lifetime value for patients is higher, use your own numbers and calculate what those are, because then you have a clear picture that is accurate for your practice. The next practice I looked at was ophthalmology, and their turnover rate had some other indicators that determined it, but it was somewhere between 25 and 35% average. So we took 30%. The average annual value per patient in ophthalmology is somewhere between $400 and $1,200. And the average number of patients that an ophthalmologist sees is 4,000. So we took 30%, which is the average turnover, times 4,000, that's 1,200 patients. And then we multiplied that by $800 average patient value, giving us $480,000 per year for that is at stake if an ophthalmologist in your practice leaves. Now, if we again look at lifetime value, we're taking that same number of patients, and the average patient value is somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000. I use 6, so we're taking 1,200 patients times $6,000. It's a lifetime value, patient value of $7.2 million walking out the door for every time a physician leaves your practice in lifetime value. And so if you're just thinking, oh, they're walking out the door and it's not costing us anything, these are the numbers you need to be aware of. When we looked at dental turnover, it was a little bit higher. It was between 35 and 45% of patients that would be transitioning with a dentist when he leaves. And the average annual patient revenue is somewhere between $500 and $800 just for cleaning and not for extensive dental work. So that doesn't include crowns or root canals or any of the other more expensive dental work, but we will dive into that with a lifetime value. So the average dentist sees around 1,600 patients a year. And so if we took 40% of that, that's 640 patients that have the potential of leaving with the physician, and we multiply that by $600 average patient yearly value, and that is $384,000 per year per physician. So if we look at the lifetime value, which is estimated between $4,500 and $7,500 per patient, and we take that same number, 640 patients, and we multiply it by the average, which is around $6,000, that physician is taking with him or her $3.84 million. So when you're looking at a physician leaving the practice, you have to take into consideration is if you're replacing them, will that value be replaced and then some? Because most practices just assume that every patient is going to roll over to the new dentist. What we're finding is that's not true for every patient. And then the last specialty that I looked at was functional medicine. Now, this is a little bit different because it's a very relationship-based specialty, more so than any of the others that we talked about. But if you're losing a functional medicine practitioner and physician from your practice, financially, it can be a very substantial challenge. If we look at functional medicine patient turnover rates, they're somewhere between 60 and 80% if the physician leaves. And the average patient value yearly is between $1,500 and $3,500 a year. When we look at the average number of patients that a functional medicine doctor sees, that's around 600. And we multiply that by 70%, that's 420 patients walking out the door. That's way more than half. And then we multiply that by the average annual patient revenue of $2,500. That's just over $1 million walking out the door with that physician yearly. If we look at lifetime value, that's somewhere between $4,500 and $12,000. We take that same 420 patients and multiply it by 8,000, which is the average between there. And that is $3.36 million leaving the practice with that physician. That can be detrimental, to say the least, to a practice. They have the highest percentage of turnover when a physician leaves. And so I wanted to bring it to the attention because if you're in that specialty and you have functional medicine practitioners and physicians in your practice, that could make or break your practice, especially if you don't have a plan in place that immediately is replacing that physician or a transitionary period to try to offset the number of patients that will leave with that physician. So if you tune in regularly, you know that I always include a 3-step action plan. And these 3 steps are meant to be simple and effective so that you can gain traction and moving forward quickly creating a plan and gaining some traction, especially if you're in the middle of a transition. And so this week's action plan is really focused on practices that are either going to go through a transition pretty quickly or for those that want to plan for future transitions. The first step of the action plan actually applies to every practice, and that's to build a patient relationship plan so that you're ready for any transitions that might come across your practice. And that way you're not rushing the last month that a transition is going to happen. You actually already have communication processes established and your patients are used to hearing from you so that if there is a transition, you have a buildup and an opportunity to communicate that with them and answer any questions and alleviate any fears or doubts around the transition and to make sure that it goes off as smoothly as possible. In that communication plan with your patients, you should get in the habit of having regular conversations with them. This is one thing I see most practices not do. They are very good about sending reminders for the most part and reminding you about your appointments in 9 different ways, but they're not good about communicating what's going on within the practice or what, might be of interest to their patients and developing a conversation and creating pathways for conversation to naturally occur within that communication process. Step number 2 is if you are indeed planning a transition or you have a physician that is planning to leave, is to ensure that you've created some type of overlap plan for the new physician to work alongside or be introduced by the current physician. And this takes some planning as well. So that means that you have to have the new physician there and the old physician, and that there has to be an overlap period for both physicians to be talking to each other and talking to the patient so that you can build rapport, you can start to build trust. And if, for example, in the case of my dentist, one physician is leaving to retire, you still can maintain and grow the relationship with the new physician. And without a plan in place, we just assume that this is going to naturally happen, and that's where trouble starts and where patients start to search for other options. And so you want to make sure that you're deliberate about how that transition is happening and ensuring that the patient is put front and center in part of that transition plan. And then step number 3, which is also often overlooked, is to purposefully reach out to your most valued patients, whether those are patients that have been with you the longest or that perhaps have leaned on you the most in your practice, and have a conversation with them one-on-one if possible about the transition, because this is going to say that to them, you are important. We wanted you to know first, and we want to make sure that you are taken care of during this transition. This does a couple of things. One, it solidifies the current relationship that the patient has with your practice and with the current physician, but it also gives you the opportunity to build rapport and trust with the new physician, as well as solidifying in their minds that they are important to you and your practice, so important that you took the time to have a conversation with them, so that any referrals, chances are pretty high here that they are one of your largest referral sources, and people that they would mention your practice to will be in a favorable light. And so if you don't take this step, and yes, it can be a little bit more time intensive, but if you're planning ahead, like I'm hoping you are 1 to 3 years ahead, then you have the opportunity to have this conversation when they're in your office. You don't necessarily need to call them on the phone, but you can have that one-on-one conversation, and it doesn't have to be lengthy, but it does have to be personalized and feel like it was intentionally set up for them to have that conversation. Any of the opportunities you have to build that rapport with patients is only going to add value to your practice and to the remaining team and physicians that are with the practice when that physician leaves. So that's your 3-step action plan. And if you're listening to this episode and you're like, we don't even know where to start, we don't have an action plan, we don't communicate with our patients, don't worry. I would hope that you're not hard on yourself if you're not doing these things and you don't have a plan in place, simply because this is not innate to the medical community. You are taught very much all of the behind the scenes on how to heal and treat people, but what you're not up to speed on most often is how to run your business, because you frankly never thought you were going to have to be behind the scenes running your business and taking on 9, 10, 11 different roles other than your physician role. If the case is that you don't know where to start and you're looking around thinking, we know that 2 of our doctors are going to be leaving in the next year, we don't have a plan, the perfect opportunity to sit down with me for 20 minutes on a triage call, and we can map this out. We can look at what needs to happen, what kind of time frame you have for that to happen, and create a plan together. If you want to jump on that call, the link for that call is below the video, and I would be honored and happy to help you with that transition or any other challenges that you're looking at, like calculating revenue loss. In the meantime, I appreciate you being here and tuning in each week. If you found value in this episode, I would love for you to share it with someone else, and I will plan on seeing you here next week. Be well, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.